Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be able to talk to you today about sex worker inclusion in policy making based on lessons from my research with the Philippine Sex Workers Collective. So this was my PhD dissertation at the University of Cambridge, and it's something that I am working towards turning into a book. So very briefly, I want to walk you through sex work regulation in the Philippines for the rest of this talk to make sense. We have a confusing mix of laws that regulate sex work in the Philippines. So we still have the criminalization of the sale of sex under our revised penal code. And here, sex workers are defined only as women. So under the revised penal code, sex workers can actually be arrested, fined, or jailed. But under a later law, the anti-trafficking law, the payment or profit from the prostitution of others is seen as a trafficking offense, which then casts clients and third parties as traffickers, and therefore prostitutes as victims. So that's the language in the anti-trafficking law. It's a later law, and it was meant as a corrective to the penal code. So without quite repealing it, it's meant to engineer a sympathetic shift towards viewing sex workers as victims instead of criminals, ostensibly. And an even later law, the Magna Carta for Women, more explicitly defines prostitution as violence against women. So this is an adoption of the Nordic model or the equality model, which supposedly criminalizes one side of the equation and treats sex workers as victims. But of course, they too can get criminalized if they work together. Now, there are also a bunch of laws, such as the Sanitation Code and the Labor Code, which tacitly recognize the existence of sex work through requirements for STD clearances in massage parlors and through the provision of rights for certain women workers who work in bars and commercial establishments. So all these laws are active at the same time. And the confusion trickles down to local governments as well. So different local governments have different approaches to sex work, which then gives the police massive discretion over which set of laws to implement at any given time. And whether sex workers are viewed as workers or criminals or victims, they've always been excluded from these conversations. So they haven't been able to shape the direction of these regulations. And my research project was exactly a response to that form of epistemic injustice, right? Of sex workers being seen as less credible or less authoritative about their lives and being excluded from many of these debates. And so I wanted to answer two big questions in this project. One, how is sex work represented and addressed in anti-trafficking laws, policies, and practices, and related legislation? So by related legislation, I'm referring to the Magna Carta for Women and also a proposed anti-prostitution law that is essentially part of the set of policies that's being promoted by the anti-trafficking apparatus. So how does the dominant understanding of sex work as, victimizing as distinct from labor compare with Filipino sex workers' own reflections on their lived experiences? And the second part is, how do Filipino sex workers experience anti-trafficking interventions? So the most common ones are raids, rescue operations, rehabilitation, bar closures, the criminalization of the purchase of sex and third-party facilitation, or even the practice of offloading Filipino travelers, especially single women travelers who are suspected of engaging in sex work overseas, largely as a result of profiling by immigration officials. So someone who might not have an extensive travel record, or someone who isn't seen as having enough money or enough resources to be traveling. So how do all these interventions actually affect sex workers? Do they meaningfully improve their lives, or might they actually increase their precarity? The bit of this project that I want to focus on is really the harm of criminalization and the importance of sex workers being meaningfully included in policy making. So very brief introduction as well to the Philippine Sex Workers Collective. It's a loose alliance of Filipino sex workers who oppose criminalization, but they also oppose the conflation of sex work with trafficking. So they don't want sex workers to be viewed as criminals, but they also don't want them to be viewed as victims. And they think that there's a clear distinction between trafficking victims and sex workers. So they view sex work as work, and their preferred path for improving the safety, the health, and the working conditions of sex workers is through labor rights. The collective is composed of men and women, both cis and trans. They are not a legally registered organization because sex work is criminalized. Leaders and members remain anonymous, but they do have a fairly active social media presence. And their leaders grant some media interviews and engage with some researchers, but just use pseudonyms. The collective has always struggled with fundraising and members have had to pay for their activism out of pocket. It's hard to fundraise if you do not have a legal registration or an office or a bank account. And they also struggle with recruiting members or doing outreach with members because they have no funding for this. And the organization has been incredibly devastated by the pandemic and has not quite been able to recover to its previous level of activity. Some members of the collective are also part of HIV or AIDS organizations, but they may not necessarily disclose their sex work experience to these organizations. The collective is not supported by other groups in the sexual rights or human rights or women's rights spaces. They've approached Amnesty International Philippines, which has disagreed with Amnesty International's institutional stance in favor of decriminalizing sex work. And they've also approached prominent constituencies in the LGBT rights movement who have said that it's just too politically costly to support sex work in the Philippine political climate, where the dominant perspective is really that sex cannot be work. And the raid and rescue model is the common intervention. Although this is slowly changing with a younger generation of scholars and activists. So the collective was initially hesitant to collaborate with me when I approached them because of their previous problematic encounters with academics, researchers, and journalists, where their privacy was not protected, or they felt that the research process was incredibly extractive. So people, in their words, mined them for data and accessed intimate experiences and stories of violence and abuse, only to abandon them after. So there's no material improvement in their lives, or they felt that their stories were weaponized for policy ends that they would not have agreed with. So, for example, stories of violence at the hands of clients were weaponized in favor of arguments supporting the criminalization of prostitution. So they did make me go through an extensive and very fair vetting process, but they eventually agreed that our aims had aligned, and they agreed on a research partnership, provided that this would not be construed as a benevolent action on my part. So they helped with my research framework and methods and recruiting participants, including those outside the collective. So these research methods I used involved collective storytelling, incorporating objects, music, and photos in the research process. And I've spoken to over 100 adult women sex workers in the Philippines. And this collaboration with the collective is ongoing. This research I see is both an academic and a political project. And based on the stories of the sex workers I've spoken to, both who were members and non-members of the collective, these were some of the harms of criminalization. So the sex workers were unable to represent themselves because of a threat of arrest and harassment. Some of them are able to represent some of their interests through HIV or AIDS groups, who are seen as more legitimate political actors and who effectively receive most of the funding. But it also really depends on the priorities of these organizations, and they're not always able to push for sex worker-specific interventions and funding. Some sex workers still hesitate to access healthcare, even if there are some improvements in the quality of care provided by social hygiene clinics and commercial centers. Their experiences still vary depending on locality. So there's still some experience of stigmatization or anticipatory discrimination. Some sex workers do not test for HIV for fear of disclosure. They are very vulnerable to police extortion. Some of them have actually described the police as the real traffickers, because in exchange for not arresting them, the police just demand bribes or sexual favors. and some of them provide these things preemptively already. And under Duterte's incredibly violent drug war, some sex workers are afraid of accessing HIV drugs for fear of getting tagged in the drug war, being tagged as a drug user as well. And the long-standing association of sex work with drugs has meant that they have been indiscriminately targeted by the police, who have threatened to plant drugs on them in exchange again for money or favors. And this is true especially of street workers. But it's been harder for them to fight back because they are criminalized or stigmatized to begin with. So there's been a lot of criticism of other groups who are targeted in this war, such as urban poor males, journalists, human rights activists, but rarely do we hear about what's happened to sex workers. And obviously under this drug war, in general, the police just has more immunity. And these were the harms of the rescue rather than rights model. Whether they were arrested or rescued was indistinguishable to many sex workers who experienced both as similar processes. Both processes involved being violently removed from their place of work and outed to their families. Both processes involved losing income, even for those who were placed in rehabilitation shelters, and a lack of alternatives. In both cases, they were redirected towards low-wage and labor-intensive and precarious work anyway, such as domestic work, factory work, hairdressing, being a seamstress. They've also experienced it as a process where sex workers were divided into good or bad groups. The good ones were those who provided a credible performance of victimhood and who were seen as deserving of sympathy. But if they didn't provide that, then they were still punished with police brutality and fines. And as a result, they still don't want to engage with state institutions for fear of getting identified and rescued or their clients arrested. And under this model of rescue, of assuming that they're victims, no matter how well-meaning it is, they still don't have political agency because they aren't seen as political actors. And only actors who assume a victim identity are allowed to speak in consultations around trafficking, sexual exploitation, or sexual violence. So that's the price of admission. And while the experiences of trafficking survivors are incredibly valuable and should never be discounted, they are being taken as representative of all individuals in the sex industry, including sex workers who don't identify as trafficking victims. And so their knowledge and experience is disregarded in policymaking. And these are all self-explanatory harms. The conclusion here is, based on this case, sex workers can better control their working conditions when they are meaningfully included in policy conversations about issues that affect them, and when sex work is decriminalized, which will allow them to organize, raise funds, and more easily seek legal representation. They are well positioned to identify their needs and suggest relevant interventions. We just need to listen. Thank you very much.